The sun in the sky has a smile on his face, and he's shining a salute to the American race.
So I've been rewatching Futurama recently to help me fall asleep at night because I've basically broken my brain to the point that I can't fall asleep with just my own thoughts anymore. So for background noise, I cycle through my favorite adult animation shows, and recently that's been Futurama. And with Futurama, I've realized two things. One, it's a banger of a show. But two, I really love the different text gags during the opening title sequences of each episode. I think it's because they pop up right at the start of the episodes, so they're the only jokes that I can definitively process before I start dozing off. But in this liminal state of half awakeness, I keep finding myself laughing at some of the opening jokes that the writers came up with. Even on repeat viewings, these jokes still hit. It's just quality comedy writing, which is really hard to do in this particular format. Because usually when you're writing jokes for television, they've got a lot going for them. There's setup lines to establish the premise and context within the scene to make it make sense. They're also typically recited verbally or performed physically, so the cadence of an actor's voice or the movement of the character can really help sell the laugh. But a text gag is text. The delivery of the setup and the punchline are self-contained. It can rely on some familiarity, like a newspaper headline or an advertisement, sure, but at the end of the day, it's reading. There's no confounding variables. The joke either works on its own or it doesn't work at all. The precedent for this standard of joke was set in the opening credits of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. For the Zoomers watching, Monty Python is the godfather of modern comedy and the inspiration for like 60% of the bits that you've laughed at in sitcoms in the last 30 years. And in the opening sequence of Holy Grail, they break out one of the first modern text gags. It's a classic joke, but you can see the utility. The text gag lets the writers get a joke off before the movie has even started. There's also a personal element to it, because text gags aren't said by any character and sometimes don't even exist in the universe of the story at all. They're purely nods to the audience, a sort of in-joke between the writer and the viewer. That's why these bits are so interesting to me. Jokes like these signify high-quality writing. Only the best can draw humor from the filler. And it shows. Just look at which shows are using the text gag. The chalkboard gag, like the rest of The Simpsons, is an institution. And there's a reason why The Simpsons opening title sequence is consistently ranked the best of all time. Along with the iconic couch gag, the ever-changing text scrawled across the chalkboard by Bart had people laughing before the title card even showed. Writers could make abstract jokes or topical references, and they usually worked. Well, at first they did. Another show that made use of the title sequence text gag was American Dad, which you saw an example of during the opening text gag of this video. Sadly, it was scrapped after season 4, but it still remains a fan-favorite bit from the early seasons. #BringBackNewspaperGags. Bob's Burgers also has a great title text gag, where the store next to the Belchers is always some ridiculous pun. Big shout out to Bedazed and Confused, You Do the Meth Recovery Clinic, and Butt Stuff Underwear Outlet. But text gags can exist in other places besides the show's opening titles. The best comedy writers also utilize the text gag in establishing shots between scenes. And this is where animation's advantage comes into play. Because the standard practice of sitcoms of the last 70 years is that when you do an establishing shot, it's generally just an exterior location with a classic stinger played over it. A building and a little to carry us into the next scene. But because animation is, and this may come as a shock to some of you, animated, writers can plausibly write jokes anywhere in the frame. So why just use a boring exterior shot of an IRL building when you can write some nonsense on the sign to completely rip the establishment apart? The shows that really nail this technique are, unsurprisingly, the Matt Groening shows, Futurama and The Simpsons, as well as Seth MacFarlane's shows like Family Guy and American Dad. This type of gag is also especially good for geography jokes, which fans of this channel know I'm a bit of a loser for. But generally speaking, it's just nice to get an added laugh out of what was previously just a filler sequence in a sitcom's runtime. It's a welcomed extra effort in a sea of lazily produced, as my grandpa would say, schlock. Which brings us to our final type of text gag that I want to discuss today. Because text gags don't just have to precede the show or a particular scene. The best writers will employ a text gag within the action itself. And there's no show that does this better than BoJack Horsemen. I'm honestly shocked that I went this long talking about high quality adult animation writing without mentioning BoJack. Because it's the best. At everything. But there's entire college courses worth of material out there on how good BoJack is, so rather than turn this into a full-blown rant, I want to focus on one specific aspect of BoJack Horsemen that I believe it does better than any show I've mentioned here, and that is the background text gag. See, BoJack exists in a unique space in sitcom history. Unlike the other shows I mentioned in this video, BoJack was designed and made specifically for Netflix, a streaming service. Meaning that the jokes were written with the full knowledge that the viewer would have the ability to pause the show at will, which, again, for the Zoomers watching, is not a luxury that you always had. Dense, text-based jokes that existed outside the focus of a scene just weren't feasible prior to the advent of streaming. The only way a joke like this could work would be in the rare nod to the DVD viewer who could actually pause the show and catch the joke. But BoJack doesn't have that limitation, and the writers knew it, and they made the goddamn most out of it. Every time there's a celebration in the show, you better believe the banner got misprinted at the party supply store. A news broadcast is appearing on a television in the show's universe, you better believe that there's an entire newsreel's worth of fake headlines running across the chyron at the bottom of the screen. We're flashing back to the 80s or 90s or early 2000s. Forget one scene transitioning period joke. Here's an entire 20-second sequence of a character driving down a busy street with every inch of the screen littered with background text references to that decade's culture. But I think the best example of this absolutely absurd attention to detail the writers on BoJack have is this scene where Todd and Mr. Peanut Butter are supposed to announce that year's Oscar nominees, but they lose the list and are forced to come up with the nominees themselves. And they talk about it a little bit, but it's mostly just in the background as the scenes play out. But can we just appreciate how many jokes they put on this damn whiteboard? Like, they didn't need to do this. A lesser show just has illegible scribbles written on the board to give the illusion something's written. But nah, the BoJack writers take the time to make this. You even get different pieces of it visible in different shots. This is what animated comedy can be at its best. Because sitcoms are simple. And when I say that, I don't mean to say they're easy to produce or don't explore deeper themes like other shows, because that's just not true. What I mean is that the priorities for what we as a culture decide are good sitcoms are simple. In a traditional drama, elements like plot and visual direction and sound and actor performance are foundational to a show's success. If any one element is done poorly enough, it can break the immersion and the story just won't hit the same. But with sitcoms, there's really only one thing that matters. Are the jokes funny? So when a gag has very little setup or context, and no wiggle room for how it's delivered, and it's not even necessary to serve the plot or establish the characters in a scene, lesser writers simply won't write them. But the best sitcom writers can make anything funny, even the mundane, structural parts of a production like establishing shots, backgrounds, and title cards. And in the age of streaming, there's no longer a theoretical limit to the type of text gag you can get away with. Writers need to recognize, as the BoJack team did, that audiences are getting smarter and more in control of what they watch. And with the hive mind of internet forums poring over every frame of their favorite shows, there's really no excuse for background scribbles anymore. Use every inch of the space that you've created. Your most dedicated fans will thank you for it with video essays that explain your craft until it isn't funny anymore.